Hello. Looks like we don't have anybody online yet, so I'm going to go ahead and chat for a few minutes and see if anyone joins in or if we have any questions, which right now we don't. So if we get some in the next few minutes, we'll address those. If not, we'll do something real quick and then we'll let you go on with the rest of your evening. I assume that right now we are in hardcore study mode. We're a little over a week out from the test. It is the 15th of May, which is just over a week and a half or so away. So I'm sure that's what we're doing. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to take a practice test of some kind to kind of get the feeling of the timing of the test, how to pace yourself, and what kind of pacing looks like for that. Hopefully you've been able to get some feedback on that and kind of see what you did well on and maybe some areas that you need to focus on. I know the last couple of weeks there's been lots of questions about how to study. Once you've taken a practice test, that should also help you a lot in terms of narrowing down the things that you need to focus the most on, or the concept that you need to focus the most on. That doesn't mean to neglect the others, but once you kind of have a baseline for your knowledge, you can kind of start from there. So a couple of things. Once again, you should be spending as much time as you can with your teacher and asking lots and lots and lots of questions so that you can be as successful as possible. All right, let me go and talk a little bit about the writing process. So there are several videos that deal with the writing process, and so I kind of want to talk about those a little bit today. We touched on urbanization, some of the highlights last week. And since there aren't really any questions about that today, we're going to go ahead and move on past that, unless some people add some questions. So I have a video on the MOOC that kind of deals with the idea of the writing process. And I highly encourage for you to watch that if you have not done so yet. So basically, I'll run through the basics of that video and some of my basic rules for writing an FRQ, or free response question, or constructed response, whatever term we want to use for that. And if you've had a chance to view any of Ms. Granquist's review materials, or if you will view any of her review materials that she'll be putting out in the next couple of days, she will have a very similar process. She kind of I kind of borrowed mine from her. She kind of taught me how to write these, and I think this method works pretty well. Basically, one of the things that I have seen over time from students is that they get into a writing situation and they kind of panic. Even if they know the material, they kind of panic. Even if they've written lots of essays, they kind of panic sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. So I wanted to kind of go over some of those things today. So the first thing to remember is how much time you have. So you have 70 minutes to write 3 short FRQs, 3 free response questions. And those FRQs are usually multiple parts. And those parts are usually labeled A, B, C, sometimes D, in some cases. And so the question then becomes that I get a lot is, should I address those in order? I think you can answer them in any order you want to, but you should write them in order. So if you are going to start in the middle of a question, leave space for part A, because as a grader, what we do is we read lots of essays. We'll read, a couple hundred a day sometimes. And we're looking for points. We're looking for ways to give students points. And the easier it is to find those points, the easier it is, the more flow, the more organization, the better your writing follows the essay, follows the outline that the question gives you, the easier it is for us to find those points. Okay, so make it easier on me as a grader to find those. Okay, I don't know the people that I'm grading. I've never read their stuff. They're not my kids. I can't give them the benefit of the doubt because I don't know them. Right? I don't know what they really know and if this writing reflects their knowledge or not. I have to go by what's on the paper. So give me an outline to use. Give me a nice flow to your writing. Okay. So structure it in that way. So part A, answer part A, then part B, then part C. Now, if you would like to skip a few lines between sections in order to give yourself some room to go back, that's awesome too. That's great. But just keep that outline in mind. So when you first see the question, the first thing you should do is take about 5 minutes. Take about 5 minutes to do some brainstorming, do some pre-writing. I know your English teachers harp on the writing process. Guys, I cannot stress enough how important that process is. For the rest of your life, when you do formal writing, use the writing process. And while you can't do a full writing process on your FRQs, you need to take that first 3 to 5 minutes to do some outlining, do some brainstorming, do some pre-writing for the question. Okay, organize your thoughts. Organize your thoughts. Okay, so the first thing you should do is start to organize your thoughts around the question. What is the question asking? Okay, what are the verbs that it's using? Okay, is it asking you to identify? Is it asking you to evaluate? Is it asking you to explain or discuss? You need to address the actual verb. If it says identify, identify. If it says discuss or explain, discuss or explain. Don't discuss or explain if it asks you to identify or vice versa. Okay, because you may not you may not include the information that needs to be in there. So then so the first step should be, what is the question asking me? The next step should be, what are the major concepts being addressed? All right. So if the major concepts are, all right, there's some references here to things from urbanization. There's some references in here to things from agriculture. All right. Then the next thing is, okay, what are some of the more smaller subtopics that are being addressed, that are being asked in this question? Okay. All right. So this is about urbanization. It's about urban models. Okay. All right. It's about agriculture. It's about agriculture models. Okay. Okay. So it wants me to do a comparison between these two, between an urban model and a agricultural model. Okay, so use your time to do this. Do not rush through. And then I would start to make a really short, brief outline of the main points that go under each of those letters in your answer. So in your scratch space, or at the front of your question, whatever, start writing some of those things down and making note of those things. Okay, I find that while 15 minutes doesn't sound like a lot of time, or 20 minutes doesn't sound like a lot of time, if you organize, you can do a lot in that time. If you know your stuff, and you've studied, and you've put in the work on the front end, and you organize your writing in the first 3 to 5 minutes, and you use that time to organize, you can write a really good FRQ in 15 minutes. Okay. If you don't organize, one of the things that I have seen is that students will go in there and they'll just start writing. And one of two things happens. Either they write way too much and it's impossible to follow and impossible to find things, and it's hard to get a sense of whether you actually are addressing the question, right? So if you just write and dump everything out of your brain on the page, it's really hard to get a sense that, one, you know what you're talking about, and two, that you understand what the question is asking, because you're not really answering the question. Okay, this is not necessarily the type of writing where more information is better. It is better to write these in a detailed and specific, but to the point and concise way. If you can do that, if you can write these in a very succinct and to the point and concise way, following the outline, addressing the question, looking at those verbs, and including the right information, you can actually write a fairly short, in terms of length, response to these questions, and do really, really well if you do that. Okay, so that's the problem number one, is students just dumping everything out of their brain on the page, not organizing their writing, not organizing their thoughts. One of the things that one of my wife's college professor friends talks about, she teaches writing, and one of the things that she says is that when we see students that struggle with writing, it's not that they're bad writers, it's that their thinking process is not where it needs to be. And that's not to make fun of people or to put people down. It may just be that very moment on that topic, their thoughts are not together, their thoughts are not organized, their thoughts are not ready. And that's why that 3 to 5 minute process is important. Get the thinking where it needs to be before you write, so that you can think about things, organize them before you go. The other problem is that students will just write not very much at all. They'll be too brief or not detailed enough. Okay. One of the things that I have found, especially with my early writers in my class, is that they're used to doing writing that doesn't ask much of them in terms of thinking. And so over the course of the year, what we end up doing is spending a lot of time on and a lot of feedback on their writing about, you need to be more specific. You need to give examples. You need to relate this to things. Okay. I have a couple of rules that I follow, and the College Board, the graders go back and forth on some of these rules. My rule is, if it asks for 2, is do a +1 example. So if it asks for 1 example of something, give 2. If it asks for 3 examples, try to give a 4th one. Okay. Even if it asks for no examples, but give one. Always give an example of what you're talking about, right? So if you're talking about, the von Thunen model, give an example of, a context in which it works. Or if you're talking about the assumptions of the von Thunen model, talk about some of those assumptions. Anything that kind of contextualizes your writing a little better, even if it's not asking for specific examples. Now, that does not mean that examples are all you should give. That's not good either, because that doesn't address the question, right? So if I say, what's in it, define supranationalism, and you define it as the Basques in Spain. Well, okay, that's an example, but that doesn't tell me what it is, right? So being careful to understand the need to find the balance between the thinking and the depth and the analysis and the examples, and the need to be short and to the point. Okay, or let me not say short. Let me just say appropriately long and to the point. Okay, this is very different than what you might write in English, where they, really want you to elaborate on things and use lots of rhetorical devices and things like that. They're very specific questions. They're very directed answers. So be thinking about, how do I answer this in a way that is complete, has enough depth, has enough context and examples, but shows that my thoughts are organized and that I understand the concepts. That is why the organization part is so important, because you are more likely to include and remember things as you are doing that pre-writing step than if you are to just immediately start writing. And I know the feeling. You're like, I only have 70 minutes to write 3 of these things. I gotta go. And I understand that impulse, and I understand the anxiety that comes with a standardized test situation. We just finished, our round of state testing today, and it's like this huge weight off our shoulders to be done with that. So I understand that right, time. I get that, but really, I cannot stress enough how important it is to slow down, think things through, analyze, ask yourself what it's asking, do some structuring and some organizing of your writing, because really what you're doing is you're structuring and organizing your thinking, and that's really what we want to see. We want to see that you have thought through these things, and that you've put thought into your answers, and that you really have constructed a response that really addresses the prompt in an appropriate way. And the best way to do that is to take some of that time, relax, take a deep breath, and then go. One of the other questions that I often get from my students when we start the writing process is, how much should I write? And the answer is, write until you've answered the question, and then stop. There's no reason to just keep writing. Writing. There's no need to do that. And the other question is, what if I don't know something? Fine. Don't spend a whole lot of time on a question you don't know. That's true of the multiple choice, and that's true of the writing. Okay. move on to the next question. Okay, write that one and then come back. If you've got time at the end and you're confident with your other two responses, you can stare at that last question as long as you need to until time runs out. But don't do it until everything else is finished. If you're just going to stare at the page and hope that the answer falls in onto your head from heaven, you are more than welcome to do that, but do that last. Okay. Now, that being said, you may write something in one of those other questions that jars your memory, helps you remember what you need. And so that's also why you want to make sure that you are spending the right amount of time, but then not bogging down, not waiting, not just hoping and stressing out about the answer that you don't know. Okay, focus on the ones that you do. Focus on the things that you do well. Okay. All right. A lot. I don't know who A lot is, but I assume you have lots of stuff. Ask a question about any advice on how to pace yourself. That's kind of a difficult question. There's kind of different ways to do this. And so I have students who like to write and circle all their answers. And they like to go through and they like to circle all their answers first, right? So they go through the test, they read the question, they read the answers, they decide on the answer that they like, and they circle it. And they go all the way through the test booklet. And that is a perfectly acceptable strategy. The only thing you have to be concerned about then is, have I left myself enough time to bubble these things in and to bubble these things in accurately? A few years ago, I had a student that, when she took the test, wrote all of her answers in the book, but took all the time writing them in the answer book and ran out of time to bubble. And so she didn't get credit for most of her answers, which were probably mostly correct because she was a very hard worker and studied a lot. So that is one strategy. That's one strategy that I think helps students who are worried about time, because it allows you to spend more time looking at questions and you're not going back and forth from one thing to another. You're committing a lot of time to the actual questions and less time to the procedure of filling in the blanks. The bubbles are important. They're very, very, very important, but that's one strategy. Some people like to answer a question and then bubble, answer a question, then bubble. It's completely up to you. Whatever you feel more comfortable with. You've done this before. Right, you've taken these kind of tests before, and so I would not worry too much about that piece of it. Whatever is most comfortable. In terms of pacing yourself, so on the multiple choice, you're going to have something like 75 questions in 60 minutes. Does that sound right? Something like that. So I mean, you've got a little over a minute per question. I'm sorry, a little less than a minute per question. And I don't say that to freak you out, but I really would look at a question and say, which ones do I know? Which ones do I feel comfortable with? And bubble and do those. Circle the ones you don't and come back to them. The more time you spend staring at something that you don't know, the less time you're going to have. Plus, I also find that answering the ones that I know kind of makes me feel more confident. I build some confidence. I feel better about how I'm doing, and it gives me a little more confidence when I come back to those questions that I'm not so sure about. Because now I'm like, okay, I could probably do this. So that's a strategy that I recommend. It's not one that I personally use on these kinds of tests. I am answer them in the order that they appear, bubble as you go kind of person, and that's just personal choice. But in terms of pacing, it's really up to the individual. I would say don't go too fast, don't rush, read everything carefully. Okay, read it carefully. The biggest problem that I see is people who don't read, students don't read the questions carefully enough. They rush through things like that. I also find that as a test taking strategy, most of the time you can eliminate one answer pretty quickly. Almost immediately you should be able to eliminate an answer, and that makes everything that much easier, because now you've got a 1 in 3 chance of trying to figure it out. So if you can do that, then I recommend doing that, crossing out that answer that you know is not true or just seems ridiculous, or not ridiculous. They don't have ridiculous answers. All of them are, not ridiculous, but there's usually one that you can kind of say, you know, that one's not right. I know that one's not right. So I would say the biggest thing to do is, and I find one of the things that helps me to prepare for tests is to not actually cram before the test, is to get all my studying in the day before, and I would say by, you know, 8 or 9 o'clock the night before, I'm done. I'm going to put everything away, get a good night's sleep, going to get up maybe a little bit earlier than I normally would, just so that I'm wide awake when I get to the testing site, have something to eat, and kind of go into the test a little more relaxed than if I am studying right up to the moment of the test. That just doesn't work for me. That actually builds anxiety, and I don't like to feel anxious in those situations, especially when a lot of people already feel anxious. It's probably not a good idea to add to that anxiety. In terms of the essay lot, you know, once again, organization, taking time to think through your answers, plan it out, organize it, do some brainstorming and some pre-writing and some outlining before you write. Other than that, I don't really have any suggestions as for how to pace yourself, other than take care of yourself going into the test and do what feels comfortable to you. Okay, don't feel like you have to do something out of the ordinary in order to get through the number of questions. Because to be honest with you, if you get into the test and you know your stuff, you're gonna work at a certain pace. If you're struggling with some questions, you're gonna work at a different pace, and that's just the way it is. But if you're, you know, if you answer those questions that you know, you're gonna start at a faster pace. Then when you come back to the ones you're less familiar with, you're gonna slow down a little bit, and that's just the way test taking works. I will say, though, that if you are, you know, halfway through the test and you're only on question 10, you know, maybe kind of moving along through and finding some of those ones that you're more confident with might be a good idea. Right? If you find yourself moving very, very slowly through the test, maybe moving through and finding the ones that you're more comfortable with is the way to go. Once again, to build some confidence in your test taking, so that you're not, you know, always feeling anxious and in a rush. I don't know about you, but I hate feeling rushed. I really prefer it when I feel like I have more control over my time in the situation. So, a lot of hope that was helpful. I don't really have much else to add to that. I would ask other people, ask other teachers, ask your counselor, who, you know, I'm sure deals with testing stuff and therefore probably has some more kind of strategies for that. But I find that test taking strategies are very individualized on what works for you. So I can give you all the suggestions in the world that I can come up with, but it ultimately comes down to what works for you. If you've not taken a practice test, that may be something to think about when you do, you know, what kind of pace works best on these questions, and what kind of, you know, strategy do I want to use about approaching them in terms of knowledge and things like that. Okay. All right. So once again, it looks like we've got a few people hanging around today. Only one question so far, and that's fine. I'm going to go for just a little while longer, unless you guys have some specific things that you want to discuss. I feel like you guys probably are in the midst of studying a lot and really trying to grapple with all of the stuff that you learned in a year, coming at you at once. And so, you know, if that's something that you would prefer to use tonight's time with, I definitely don't want to pull you away from that. So, all right. So, a little bit about the way that the test is scored. And I may have mentioned this before, I may not have, but I'm going to go ahead and toss it out there. A question that I get a lot is, well, how many do I need to get right on the multiple choice? Or what's grade score do I need to get on my FRQ? And the problem is I can't really answer that. Because the way these tests are scored is they are normed. They are a normed test, which means that there is a reasonable distribution of scores and reasonable distribution of grades that they expect. right? So the test has been tested, the test has been used and has been validated and verified, and from that they say that there should be this many of this score and this many of this score and this many of this score. This is about what we expect, right? We expect it to fall there. And so what ends up happening is when we all come together that first week of June, there will be a group that comes in a week before, and they will start reading some sample essays. They'll pull out a certain number, they'll read through them, and from that they will create the rubric. So the rubric itself is not even created until we've had a chance to look at the responses. This doesn't mean that everything is based on student responses. It doesn't mean that the students get to determine what the rubric is. It means that there may be some changes and tweaks to what the rubric looks like in our brains once we look at how the students interpreted or maybe reacted to a question. Okay, so anyway, it's hard to say this many points equals this. What I like to tell my students is, what would be passing at your school? Like at my school, my school doesn't use a 100-point grading system. We use a very different system, but at a traditional grading system school where you have a number-based system where everything is on a 0 to 100 scale, at our school, and I think everywhere in our state actually, 70 is passing, right? I am not saying you have to get 70. I'm saying that will probably put you in a good position on the multiple choice, right? If you can go in there and you can get 70% of the questions right, you're probably going to be in good shape, right? That would mean that would probably put you in that upper group, that upper number group, that upper part of the curve where the 4s and 5s are more likely to be. Now, once again, do not quote me on this. Don't say Mr. C said if I get 70%, I'm going to get a 4 or 5. I didn't say that, because that's not the way it works, right? What I'm saying is when we try to take these numbers that aren't on the same scale and we try to put them in those terms, it's very hard. So if you can shoot for what would be passing in a context that you're familiar with, use that as your starting point, right? So as you take a practice test, as you're looking over those things, as you're quizzing yourself, say, okay, I'm not quite at that what would be passing in my context world. All right, but use that as a starting point. And the only reason why I say that is I don't fully understand all the math that goes into that. I just know that it kind of varies from place to place. So anyway, they take all of these things together and they spit out your multiple choice and your 3 FRQs, and then they do some funky math with some things that aren't even numbers. They're like squiggly lines and fractions and probably a square root or two. Blah, 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 and splits out a number. And then they kind of find some natural dividing points, some natural breaks. Okay, and they say, okay, well, about this percentage should be up here, this percentage here, this percentage here. So we're going to put these, here's where these cutoffs are going to happen. So ultimately, though, I am never all that. I don't emphasize the final score, the final grade. I think that, guys, if you've been through this course and you've done the work, you will have come out of this process having learned a whole lot. And I hope you realize that. I hope you realize how much you've learned from having gone through this. Also, guys, keep in mind that colleges are not necessarily all that interested in your score. They're really not. They don't necessarily want to give you free classes. It's nice, they will, but they don't really want to. What they want to see is, have you challenged yourself? Have you done something that was difficult as opposed to taking the easy route? Have you taken things that are going to teach you important skills, such as how to write, skills about how to think? And that's one of the benefits of what AP curriculum does and AP courses do. So as whatever that score is at the end, you should be proud of yourself that you've challenged yourself and you've done a very difficult thing. And if I'm a college admissions person and I've got a person that, didn't challenge themselves and got a really good, GPA or whatever, and someone that really did challenge themselves and theirs is lower, I'm going to go with the one who challenged themselves, because that's what the real life's going to be like. And they've proven to me that they're willing to take that on and that they're not going to take the easy road. So you should already, feel very, very proud of yourselves for what you've accomplished, and kind of thinking about the grade. I understand that's the world that we live in. I understand there's a lot of pressure and stress about those things, but really, if your teacher hasn't already told you, I will tell you now that I am proud of your accomplishments, and I'm proud of your hard work. And those of you who have been on here multiple times and asked lots of questions and really sought to know more, I really think that you have done yourself a huge benefit. Okay. All right, enough, motivational time, motivational speak. All right, so those are some test taking strategies that I would keep in mind. It's like I said, it's really up to the individual. I really think the best thing to do is to just dig into some tests, dig into some questions, look at them, think about them, and just kind of say, what's the best way for me to go about doing this? Okay. All right. It is now 8:30, and I have not gotten any more questions for today. So I am just going to once again do a real quick rundown of some of the big concepts in the in each unit. I'll just kind of run down those and do a real quick summary, and then that will probably take us up pretty close to 9 o'clock or 8:45, whichever. And next week I'll be back on, and really next week it's all about your questions. It's all about what things you want to know and how I can help you, because we're right up against it. So we will need to really work hard at that point. Okay, so I'm going to do a real quick rundown of some important concepts, and I'm going to pull up a document just that I can look at real quick. So give me about 30 seconds here. All right, I'm going to start just kind of running down the outline from the course description. If you have not seen this before, it's available online. If you just go to College Board, if you just type in APHG or AP Human Geography course outline, it will bring up the course description. And then about, I don't know, 7 or 8 or 10 pages in, it starts with the actual outline for each unit. I highly recommend, if you have not seen this, that it's a good tool to use. And so I'm just going to run down that, and it's going to hit on some of the major topics and some of that. So we're going to start with the idea of what's called traditions, or kind of the physical geography things. It's not a very large portion of the test. It's about 5 to 10%. And once again, this is what traditional geography is perceived to be. This is what, rocks and things like that. And some concepts that I think are really important to remember from this are the concept of climate and the role that climate plays in everything that we do on planet Earth. Climate affects it. Okay. Look at, understanding maps, how to read maps, what maps tell us, what maps don't tell us. How to lie with maps. Hopefully you've watched Ms. Rehnquist's video of how to lie with maps. That is one of the most awesome things that she does, in the way that she kind of communicates that idea that a map only says what we want it to say, or it can't say everything. So how do we make those choices? All right. Be familiar with the ideas of determinism versus possibilism. Once again, determinism says geography or climate or things like that, they make the decisions. Possibilism says they influence, but people also play a major role. Some people to think about in those kind of terms. Jared Diamond, in his first book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, has a very determinist kind of perspective. His later books kind of move more towards the possibilist perspective, but also kind of knowing where those lines are. There are certain things you can't do. You can't grow rice in the desert, or at least not sustainably. Right? You can't live on a civilization doing things that way. The first chapter or the first unit really is about how do we know, what are the tools that we use as geographers, what are ways that we kind of construct meaning out of things, and how do we bring in data and interpret it and use it for things. Be familiar with world regions. There's some good maps that kind of lay out the major regions. One of the things that my students kind of struggle with early on is South versus Southeast Asia. They are culturally quite different, so you would want to make sure that you understand where those are. So South Asia being the Indian subcontinent, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, while Southeast Asia is your Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, the Philippines, places like that. Knowing kind of those kind of different regions. All right. Population migration are together. Together, according to the outline, this should be about 13 to 17% of the test. And that first section, that traditions, is only about 10%. The other 90 is spread fairly evenly between the other units. Okay, so population. How do we analyze population? How do we measure it? Things like density, things like scale, things like distribution. Remember where people live and where they don't. Remember that distribution is not equal. That it is not even. It varies from place to place. We don't live in wet places, hot places, cold places, dry places, high places. Okay, understand population pyramids, how to read those, how sex and age play a role in that, patterns of fertility, mortality, and death. Think about the demographic transition model and CBD and CBR and CDR. Yes, sorry, CBD is something else completely. Think about population growth trends, so historical trends. Think about things like, think about the DTM. Think about those different theorists such as Malthus, such as Esther Bosserup, such as, those people that are going to say we're all going to die because we're going to eat ourselves to death and run out of food. And those people that say, no, we'll figure it out a way. Know what those different measurements mean. Not just individual measurements, but when we look at a country, can we look at a country and determine where they are in terms of development? Okay, so those population measures also have an impact on development measures. So they were kind of merging two units together. So be able to kind of know those differences and those overlapping pieces. Okay, and then know what countries do about it. What do we do when we have too many people? What do we do when we don't have enough people? Both of these are big problems that we need to deal with. Okay, understand the laws of migration. Why do people move? Why do people leave a place that they have a connection to? This place that has meaning for them. This place where maybe they were born, or where their parents were born, or where they have have these human experiences that are important to them. Why would they leave this place? What would make them do that? That's when we get into rules of migration or laws of migration. When we get into things like refugees and forced migrations and voluntary migrations. Why do people migrate voluntarily? Number one is economics. They perceive economic benefits someplace else, so they move. Okay. What happens to people when they move? Where do they go? And how are they received? Okay. Also, policy plays a role here as well. How do we make laws or policies or rules that determine about where people go and how many people are allowed to go there and what they do once they get there? When and how is population good for us? When and how is maybe it detrimental? It's a very controversial issue right now. We need to look at it not through a cultural political lens, but look at it through a lens of economics and population, right? So if you need people, the best way to do that is to encourage migration. If you have too many people, you might want to discourage it. Okay. All right. The next thing we kind of talked about was culture. And kind of culture is divided up into a couple of kind of big chunks. One is the kind of concepts of culture. How do we define culture? How do we, I don't want to say measure it, but how do we analyze it? So we might analyze it through the lens of popular culture versus folk culture, through different types of regions, such as vernacular regions versus formal versus functional. Understand the idea of hearths, culture hearths, agriculture regions, cities, where cities come from, are all very similar in nature and function in the way that they work. So if you understand those cultural hearths, you're also going to be on your way to understanding agricultural hearths and urban hearths as well. So talk about understand the different varieties of ways in which we define cultural blending. So the idea of acculturation or culture appropriation on one end, assimilation on the other, and all of the phases in between. One was where we just kind of cherry pick the things that we want. One is we are so immersed and intertwined with the culture we can no longer recognize our own uniqueness and identity anymore. And all of the different kind of stages in between there. And what does that mean? What does it mean to have cultures that are beginning to disappear? What does it mean when that culture change, when those cultures change? Things like that. Understand the effects of globalization and technology on culture. So if you are a folk culture person, you are going to be very skeptical and resistant to those factors that might bring about cultural change. While if you are okay with those things and culture is kind of flexible and kind of fluid, then those things might not be as concerning to you. Okay, so understand kind of the core kind of treats religion and culture themselves. So understand where religions are distributed, understand where some of the major ones originate from, understand some things about the size and growth rates of different religions, but also understand concepts such as ethnic versus I just drew a blank. Ethnic versus universalizing. Understand the idea of sacred spaces and how spaces can begin to take on important meaning based on the perceived religion context there. Understand some things about cultural landscape and material culture. How does the physical space change to reflect the people live there and the impact that they have? What does signage look like? What does the food look like? What are the smells? What are the tangible things we can hold in our hands and say this makes this place unique? Which brings me back to the idea of place. Place is very important. Place is not just a spot on the map. Place is a set of characteristics that makes a location unique from other locations. What makes my home unique? What makes my school unique? What makes my mother's house unique? Okay, to me, so those are all issues of place, and place is very important. Tying people to places is an incredibly powerful thing. Okay, understand things about language in terms of how language is spread, language families. Understand the idea of kind of where those divisions happen. How do we know what those language families look like? What is the distribution of major language groups? Okay, all right. Political organization of space, politics. How do people bring order to space, right? How do we all live together in one place and get along relatively well or not, right? So be thinking about types of borders, think about the difference between nation and nation state, and what do different nations do? How do different arrangements of nations look within a particular space? So you're overbounded, you're underbounded, you're stateless nations, and anytime you have different groups of people with different identities in the same space, how do we make that work or not work, right? Sometimes we say it's not going to work, we're going to do our own thing. Which sometimes happens peacefully, sometimes not. Okay, understand the evolution of some of those things. Understand some bigger territorial issues. So what happens to sovereignty when countries start to work together? What happens to sovereignty when countries don't? So the idea of supranationalism and devolution, when things begin to break down. When we see fragmentation, when we see cooperation, things like that. Understand things like redistricting and gerrymandering. Understand colonialism and imperialism and how that has had historical and modern day impacts on places and how those spaces were determined and divided and worked together. Okay. Sorry, I'm starting to have some allergy issues all of a sudden. So if it sounds like I'm sniffling a lot, it's because I am. But I apologize for that. Agriculture. Once again, this is I get a lot of questions about this from students. A lot of people think this is the most boring chapter. I actually kind of find it very, very interesting. Understand those revolutions. Understand how agriculture starts and how it evolves over time, and knowing that those evolutions take thousands of years in some cases. Understand the Green Revolution. Understand what's controversial about it. Understand why some people say Green Revolution awesome, some people say Green Revolution not so awesome, right? But understand why that debate happens and why that debate persists. Okay, understand the distribution of agriculture and how that distribution is tied to patterns of population and how it's tied to patterns of climate. Okay, those three things are very closely tied. People live where they can eat, and people grow food where the climate allows them to. So those three maps, if you look at them, should be similar, should have similar things happening in them, right? Major agriculture production regions, looking at rural land use patterns, so looking at things like von Thunen, looking at gender, looking at some different ways that land is used in terms of things like monoculture and pastoralism, ranching and farming. This is also the first time that we get introduced to the idea of different economic types. So the idea of primary, the idea of secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quaternary. Understanding what those different levels mean, what they are, and how those things relate to some of the bigger picture, okay? Then think about the commercialization of agriculture. Remember that for most of human history, agriculture was about subsistence, and it wasn't until the last couple of hundred years that people began to find a way to make agriculture profitable in terms of, that's all they do. And so be able to kind of talk about some of the pros, cons, benefits, drawbacks or challenges to commercial agriculture, and some of the reactions to it. Things like organic farming, things like whole food movements, farm to table, and what are some of the benefits and negatives of those things, right? It's expensive is one of the big drawbacks. Okay, woo, let me catch my breath. All right, and okay. Industrialism, understand industrial growth models. Where are things distributed? How do they set up where they want to set up? What factors determines that? What is the interaction between those different things and places? Understand some of the bigger things like the core periphery model on a global scale. Understand how we measure things like the HDMI, gender indexes, GDP, GNP, income disparities. Understand things like deindustrialization, agglomeration, where do things cluster and where do they not? Once again, this is also a place where those types of economic activities come into play. Understanding dependency and structuralist models versus our liberalist models, such as Rostow, some of those kind of things, sustainable development. And of course, in all of these contexts, women and gender play a very crucial role. Okay, cities and urban land use. Once again, know those North American models. Be vaguely familiar or be familiar with the non-Western models, but I wouldn't spend too much time with them. Know things like the rank size rule versus the primate city model. Be familiar with different types of hierarchy, such as Christaller, such as the gravity model. Be familiar with things like the zone of profitability. Understand kind of the distribution within a city of commercial, industrial, and residential. Think about problems and challenges to cities, such as demographic shifts, such as poverty, such as density, such as crime that comes out of some of those situations, and understand some of the historical reasons for those things in terms of racial segregation policies, such as public housing, that led to some clustering concerns. Understand the idea of white flight and why migration out of cities happens and creates a suburbanization trend. Be able to talk about the bid rent theory and the relationship between the central business district and land value as you move in and out of the city. So I'm just quickly running down the outline. I've kind of skipped over a lot of stuff. That doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that I'm hitting the highlights. Okay. All right. So let me go back to questions real quick. I saw that we do have one question that popped up here from Nate. Oh my gosh, I just lost my question. Nate, oh, that is not good. Hold on. Nate. Oh, okay. Whew. Thank you. Looks like Tina posted on Nate's behalf, and then Nate did again. All right. By the way, Tina, thank you. You're always here, and you always help manage the discussion board. So Nate asks, can you briefly explain the types of diffusion? Okay. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to run down the highlights of diffusion. So diffusion basically says thing A moves someplace. What's causing that movement? Okay. And then how do we understand why that movement occurs? We're looking at diffusion, right? Yes, diffusion. Okay. So think about diffusion in a couple of ways. One is, so I get a cold, and then everybody in my house gets that cold, and everybody that they come into contact gets that cold. Okay, this is contagious diffusion. So just like an illness, just like waves in a pond, right? You throw a rock in, and the waves kind of spread out from the middle. So it affects people that are adjacent to the thing. So I like tacos, so I walk into a place and say, "Hey, I've got tacos," and all of a sudden, the people near me grab tacos. And then the people behind them, they come in and they grab tacos. Next thing you know, we've all got tacos. So the tacos have diffused out from the center. So if we think about this as a cultural element or some kind of cultural trait, think about it as, maybe I'm the first person to wear, I don't know, bedazzled flip-flops to school. I mean, that's not true, but as a teacher, that might be true, right? And all of a sudden, all the other teachers are like, "Wow, that's awesome! I got to get me some purple bedazzled flip flops," right? And so, because they interacted with me, they adopt that thing, and then the people that interact with them adopt it. Okay, so that is kind of the idea of expansion or contagious diffusion. Okay, now another concept, and it's important to. This is kind of a more complicated idea, which is called hierarchical diffusion. It's also a form of expansion diffusion. But hierarchical diffusion, so contagious assumes that everybody is equally interested in adopting that cultural trait. Okay? Everybody wants tacos. Who doesn't, right? Everybody wants purple bedazzled flip-flops. Who doesn't, right? So what hierarchical assumes is that not everybody is equally ready to adopt that particular thing. And so it spreads to certain groups first and then diffuses to other groups differently. But it may not necessarily be adjacent. It may not be directly touching it. So for example, urban centers are going to diffuse things much faster and more readily than our rural areas. So you may have something jump around from urban area to another urban area to another urban area and skip the things in between at first. One great example of this is hip hop music. This is a really good example because hip hop music is by its nature of an urban origin, right? It starts off as the music popular with inner city usually minority kids, and then like in the late 70s and early 80s. It doesn't go from Chicago, Illinois to Podunk Town, Illinois next door. It goes from New York to Chicago to Philadelphia to St. Louis to Houston to LA to Seattle to Denver, and it's hopping around, skipping around from place to place, but skipping some other places. Then some people that are not in those urban centers might say, "Hey, this hip hop thing is kind of cool," and then they might start to adopt out from there. But it kind of in an order of importance of the region or willingness of the region or city to adopt it. So it's not directly contagious like we saw before. It's not like just because you're touching something, you're automatically going to diffuse it. Hierarchical assumes that there is some amount of resistance within certain places, and therefore it is not necessarily an even distribution. And that distribution may even out over time as more and more people adopt certain traits, but it doesn't start off that way. Okay, so those are some of the big kind of contagious diffusions. One of the other important ones to remember is relocation. And relocation just means, so in contagious and in hierarchical, the original source stays where it is. Hip hop doesn't go away necessarily when it moves. Right? It still stays where it is. Relocation assumes that there is some physical movement of that element, right? So this happens a lot with migration or immigration. So, if I if I'm the only one who has tacos, and then when I say tacos, because I live in Texas and we love tacos. Anyway, but we start, if I have tacos and I physically move someplace that doesn't have tacos, and all of a sudden people start liking my tacos, that's relocation diffusion, because the element itself has not spread on its own. It has spread because I have carried it. I have taken it there to that place. Okay. One of the other questions that comes up with diffusion is the idea of independent innovation versus innovation that kind of spreads. So, what happens when something happens that's similar to something else but wasn't influenced by it? So, like agriculture. Agriculture starts in the New World before there's any interaction with the Old World, right? And so agriculture starts in at least two places. Some historians say maybe even 4, 5, or 6 different places independently of that, right? So that element didn't have to diffuse for that thing to appear. That those people figured that out or adopted that idea kind of naturally and through that process. So those are kind of the different ways to think about diffusion. So think about expansion in terms of contagious versus hierarchical. Think about relocation as a common source and cause of diffusion as well. And those are the big ones. And if you can understand that how those different processes work and how those different spreads happen, you'll probably be okay for the test. Okay. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Hopefully, Nate and Lot and Tina helping to keep order and regulate on my question board. Hopefully, you guys have gotten something out of tonight. Once again, not a lot of questions, but we did cover a lot of test-taking strategies, a lot of how to write, a lot of the importance of planning and organizing your writing before you start in order to get your thinking in order so that your writing reflects that. All right. Once again, I appreciate your time tonight, guys. Next week will be our last live broadcast. Hopefully, you will not be totally freaking out as the day will be upon us. And make sure that you check back this week, as we will be putting up some more test taking, test review strategies from Ms. Granquist, who is like the queen of that stuff. She is like super awesome at it. I wish I had half of her skills and things when I was in high school, or I would be probably doing the same thing, but I would probably look cooler doing it. Anyway, so those are going to be up this week, and those should be a benefit to you. So anyway, thanks for your time, and thanks for listening to me babble, and I will see you next week.